The floodwaters had stolen everything, except the mud-caked dress clinging to Willa Harper's skin, and the iron determination that kept her standing in what used to be her front yard. She had woken 3 mornings ago to the sound of water rushing through the cottonwoods, had grabbed what she could carry, and had run for the hills with her neighbors while the Kansas River swallowed 20 years of her family's work in less than 4 hours. Now, in the cruel sunshine of May 1881, she stood ankle-deep in silt that covered the floor of her childhood home, staring at the empty strong box that had held her father's deed. The river had pried it open like a tin of crackers and taken the single piece of paper that proved this land belonged to her. "Miss Harper." Willa turned to find a man picking his way through the debris field that used to be her fence line. He wore town clothes, a vest and clean trousers that seemed obscene amid all this destruction, and he carried his hat in his hand like he was approaching a church. She recognized him vaguely from town. One of the clerks from the courthouse, maybe. Younger than her by a few years, with dark hair that curled at his collar and an open, friendly face that belonged at a dance, not a disaster. "I'm Willa Harper," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her, or I was before the river decided otherwise. "James Nash," he said, extending a hand. When she took it, his grip was warm and solid. "I work with the county recorder. I've been riding out to all the flooded properties, checking on folks." "That's kind of you." She released his hand and gestured at the wreckage around them. "As you can see, I'm doing wonderfully." He had the grace not to pretend. "It's bad. Worst flooding we've seen in 30 years. Lost count of how many homesteads went under." He paused, studying her face. "Your deed was in the house." The question hit like a fist. "You know about that already." "Word travels. Silas Crenshaw's been in the courthouse every day since the waters went down, filing claims on abandoned properties." James's expression darkened. "He's calling them salvage rights. Says if folks can't prove ownership, the land reverts to county auction." Willa's stomach dropped. Silas Crenshaw owned the property north of hers. 2,000 acres of prime bottomland that his father had bought cheap from desperate settlers during the drought of '68. He had always wanted her 160 acres, had made offers twice a year since her father died, each one lower than the last. Now he saw his chance. "The deed's gone," she said flatly. "The strong box was open when I got back. River took everything inside." James nodded slowly, then did something that surprised her. He smiled. Not a sympathetic smile, but something brighter, almost mischievous. "That's actually why I rode out here. Your father filed that deed in July of '79, right after the Homestead Act paperwork cleared. 5-year prove-up, paid in full." "Yes." She had been 17 when her father walked her through every detail, making sure she understood, making sure she could protect what was theirs. "Well, Miss Harper, every deed filed in this county gets copied into the official record book. Has been since Kansas achieved statehood. It's the law." James settled his hat back on his head and his smile widened. "I happen to spend my days managing those record books. Your deed's right there on page 412, clear as Sunday morning." For a moment, Willa couldn't breathe. "You're serious?" "Completely. I can make you a certified copy tomorrow if you want, but the record's what matters. Silas Crenshaw can file all the salvage claims he wants. Your ownership is documented in ink that predates the flood by 2 years." Something unwound in Willa's chest, something that had been wound tight since she opened that empty strong box. She sat down hard on what used to be her porch steps, not caring about the mud. "I thought I'd lost it. I thought he'd take everything." James crouched beside her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Not while I'm breathing. Crenshaw's been trying to pull this scheme on half a dozen families. I've been riding out to each one, checking records, making sure people know their rights." He paused. "Though I'll admit, yours was the one I was most worried about. Heard you were living out here alone." "I can handle alone," Willa said automatically. Then she looked around at the ruins of her home and felt the lie of it. The house had lost its roof and 2 walls. Her barn was matchsticks. Every chicken, every pig, her milk cow, all swept away. She had $12 in a coffee tin buried in the hills, the clothes she was wearing, and a mud-covered iron skillet she had found in the yard. Alone was one thing. Destitute was another. "Where have you been staying?" James asked, following her gaze. "Draper Farm, up the valley. They took in about 15 of us." She didn't mention that the Drapers had 8 children of their own and that she had been sleeping in their hay loft, trying to stay out of the way. "I'll start rebuilding soon. I just need to figure out where to start." James was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at him, he was studying the ground like it held answers. Then he said, in a carefully casual voice, "I've got a spare room at my place in town. Nothing fancy, but it's dry and it's yours if you want it. No rent, just until you get back on your feet." Willa stared at him. "You're offering me a room in your house?" "It's not improper," he said quickly, which was the moment Willa realized it absolutely was improper and that he had thought this through anyway. "My sister lives there too. Juliet's been keeping house since our mother passed. There's a spare room on the 2nd floor. We're right on Main Street next to the Mercantile. You'd have privacy, and Juliet would appreciate the company." He met her eyes, and his expression was suddenly serious. "You can't rebuild living in someone's hay loft, Miss Harper. You need a base, somewhere you can sleep without worrying, somewhere you can plan. Let me help." She wanted to say no. Every instinct she had, every lesson her father had taught her about standing on your own, demanded that she refuse. But her back ached from sleeping on hay bales, and her hands were raw from digging through mud, and this man with his easy smile and his record books was offering her something she desperately needed. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me." James stood and offered her his hand. "Because Silas Crenshaw's been using disasters to steal land since before I could walk, and I'm tired of watching good people lose everything to men like him. Because your father filed his paperwork proper and paid every cent he owed, and that should mean something. And because I've got a spare room that's sitting empty while you sleep in a barn, and that seems like poor resource management to me." Despite everything, Willa found herself smiling. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "Your sister really won't mind. Juliet's been telling me for months that the house is too quiet. She'll probably put you to work helping with her sewing projects." He paused. "Fair warning, she's teaching herself to make fancy dresses from magazine patterns. There are fabric scraps everywhere." "I can sew," Willa said. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, "All right." "Yes, thank you." The ride into town took an hour, with Willa on the borrowed horse James had brought and James walking alongside. He talked the whole way, easy, cheerful conversation about nothing in particular, and Willa realized he was doing it deliberately, filling the silence so she didn't have to. He told her about the courthouse, about the cantankerous old county recorder who insisted on using a quill pen instead of the new fountain pens. He told her about his sister's ongoing battle with the neighbor's rooster, who had opinions about property lines. He told her about the new telegraph line coming through next month, about the railroad expansion, about everything except floods and lost homes, and the fact that she had just lost everything. By the time they reached the edge of town, some of the tightness had left Willa's shoulders. The Nash house sat on a corner lot, a neat 2-story structure painted white with green shutters. It had a wide front porch and flower boxes in the windows, and Willa felt suddenly aware of how thoroughly caked in mud she was. But James just led her around to the back door, calling out as he entered, "Juliet, we've got company." A woman appeared from what looked like the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 19, with the same dark curls as her brother and a face that lit up when she saw Willa. "Oh, thank goodness. James has been worrying about you all week." "I have not been worrying," James protested. "I've been professionally concerned. He rode out to your property 3 times, but you were never there," Juliet continued, ignoring her brother entirely. "I'm Juliet Nash." "You must be Miss Harper. Please tell me you're taking the room because James has been insufferable about it." "I'm taking the room," Willa said, feeling suddenly off balance. "Though I'm afraid I'm not in any state to be a proper guest." Juliet waved this away. "We've got a bath and clean clothes and food in that order. James, stop hovering. Go make yourself useful and heat water." She took Willa's arm and steered her toward the stairs. "The room's this way. It's small, but it gets good light in the morning." The room was more than small. It was perfect. A single bed with a quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over Main Street. After a week of sleeping on hay with 17 other people, it felt like a palace. "I'll bring up the bath," Juliet said. "Take your time." "We eat at 6, but if you're too tired, I can bring something up." "I'll come down," Willa said. Then, because gratitude was choking her, "Thank you, both of you. I don't know how to repay this." Juliet smiled. "James said you'd say that. He told me to tell you that keeping Silas Crenshaw from stealing your land is payment enough." She paused at the door. "He really has been worried. He came home from the courthouse last week with a list of 15 names, families who might lose their property. He's been writing to every single one." After Juliet left, Willa sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember the last time someone had helped her without expecting something in return. Her father had been dead 3 years. Her mother had died when Willa was 12. She had been running the homestead alone since she was 18, and she had learned to trust her own strength and no one else's. But James Nash had ridden through flood wreckage to find her, had offered her shelter and asked nothing. And now his sister was heating bath water like Willa was a friend instead of a charity case. She pressed her hands to her face and allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel the enormity of everything she had lost. Then she stood, squared her shoulders, and started planning how to rebuild. Dinner that evening was venison stew and cornbread, served at a small table in the kitchen. Willa had borrowed a dress from Juliet, and though it was a bit short and a bit loose, it was clean and whole. She felt almost human again. "So the deed's safe?" Juliet asked, passing the bread. "Silas can't touch the property. The deed's recorded," James said. "But Silas has been trying to get clever. He's claiming that properties damaged beyond habitability revert to the county for public safety reasons. Says it's some territorial-era law from the 50s. "Is it?" Willa asked. "It might be. Nobody's actually found the statute yet, but Silas keeps citing it, and the county judge is old and tired and inclined to believe him." James buttered a piece of cornbread with more force than necessary. "What Silas is really doing is exploiting confusion. Half the families who got flooded out don't know their rights. They hear territorial law and county authority, and they figure they've lost. Silas swoops in with cash offers, 50 cents on the dollar, and desperate people take them." "That's vile," Juliet said. "That's Silas." James looked at Willa. "He's going to come after your land hard. He wanted it before the flood, and now he thinks you're vulnerable. You need to be ready." "What do I need to do?" Willa asked. "First, I'll get you that certified copy of the deed. You keep it on your person at all times. Second, you need to start rebuilding fast. Visible progress, improvements to the property. It undercuts his habitability argument." James leaned back in his chair, thinking. Third, you show up to the county meetings. There's one next week. Half the reason Silas gets away with this is that people are too tired or too scared to fight him. You walk in there, head high, deed in hand, and you make it clear you're not going anywhere. I can do that, Willa said. She meant it. Exhaustion was one thing, surrender was another. Good. James smiled at her, that same warm, slightly mischievous smile from the afternoon. Because I've been waiting for someone to stand up to Silas Crenshaw for about 5 years now, and I've got a feeling you're the one to do it. Why don't you do it? Willa asked. You work for the county. You've got authority. I'm a clerk, James said. I can show people the law, but I can't make them fight, and if I go after Silas directly, he'll just accuse me of overstepping my position. But you, his smile widened. You're a property owner defending your legal claim. That's unassailable. Juliet was watching her brother with an expression Willa couldn't quite read. James has been collecting evidence on Silas for 2 years, she said quietly. Every forged document, every coerced sale, every shady deal. He's just been waiting for the right moment. Juliet, James said warningly. She should know. Juliet turned to Willa. My brother's not just being helpful. He's using you as his test case. If he can prove Silas's flood claims are fraudulent, he can challenge all the other sales. He can give those families their land back. Willa looked at James, who had the grace to look embarrassed. That's not the only reason I'm helping. But it's a reason, Willa said. She didn't feel angry about it, though. She felt something else, something lighter. Good, use me. If it means stopping Silas and helping other people, use me all you want. James's expression shifted into something more serious. I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. Silas has money and connections. He's going to push back hard. He'll spread rumors, make threats, tie things up in legal proceedings. It's going to be ugly. My entire house is currently a pile of wet wood and mud, Willa said. Ugly doesn't scare me anymore. All right, then. James raised his glass of water in a mock toast. To ugly fights and stubborn women. To record books and nosy clerks, Willa replied, raising her own glass. Their eyes met across the table, and something warm curled in Willa's chest. Something that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with the way James looked at her like she was capable of anything. The next morning, James left for the courthouse at dawn. Willa woke to the smell of coffee and found Juliet already in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the efficient rhythm of long practice. You didn't have to get up, Juliet said when Willa appeared. You're a guest. I'm a freeloader, Willa corrected, reaching for an apron. Put me to work. Juliet looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she just smiled and pointed to a bowl of eggs. Scramble those. James will eat about 6 when he gets back. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Juliet said casually, My brother's a good man. I can see that, Willa said. He doesn't let many people close. Our father died when James was 15 and he took it hard, decided he had to take care of everything, handle everything himself. Juliet shaped the dough into a loaf and set it to rise. But he likes you. I can tell. Willa felt her cheeks warm. He's just being kind. He's being kind to 15 families, Juliet said, but he's not boarding any of the others, and he definitely didn't ride out to their properties 3 times in 1 week. She met Willa's eyes with a directness that reminded Willa of James. I'm not warning you off. I'm just saying be careful with him. He hides a lot behind that smile. Before Willa could respond, the back door opened and James appeared, carrying a leather document case. Got it, he said, pulling out a paper covered in official stamps and neat handwriting. 1 certified copy, county seal, the works. This says you own 160 acres in the river valley. Clear title. No encumbrances. Willa took the paper with shaking hands. Seeing her father's name, seeing the careful description of the property boundaries, made everything real again. She owned that land. It was hers. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank yourself. Your father did the paperwork right." James poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "I've also been pulling records on Silas's recent acquisitions. Found something interesting. 3 of the properties he claimed last week were filed under a territorial statute, Senate Bill 41. Thing is, Senate Bill 41 was about livestock quarantines. It has nothing to do with property seizure." "He's making it up?" Willa asked. "He's counting on nobody checking." "Judge Weatherby's been on the bench since statehood. He's a good man, but he's 73 and he's tired. When Silas comes in with official-sounding citations, the judge takes him at his word." James's expression hardened. "That's going to stop. I've been drafting a formal challenge to every claim Silas has filed since the flood. I just need you to file it." "Why me?" "Because you're an affected party. You have standing. I'm just a clerk." He smiled, but there was steel underneath. "But if you walk into that courthouse and file a formal challenge, citing specific statute numbers and demanding judicial review, the judge has to take it seriously. And once we get a real review, Silas's whole scheme falls apart." Willa looked at the certified deed in her hands, then at James. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow," James said. "Let's give Silas Crenshaw something to worry about." The next week passed in a blur of activity. Willa spent her mornings at the courthouse with James, learning the labyrinthine filing systems and county procedures. She learned that James wasn't just a clerk, but something more. The person who actually kept the entire records office running while the elderly county recorder napped at his desk. She learned that James had a gift for finding obscure precedents and citing chapter and verse from the Kansas Territorial Code. And she learned that when he was focused on a problem, he had a habit of running his hand through his hair until it stood on end, which Juliet found hilarious and Willa found unexpectedly endearing. In the afternoons, Willa rode out to her property and worked. She salvaged what she could from the wreckage, pulling nails from broken boards and stacking anything usable. She couldn't afford to rebuild the house yet, but she could clear the land and make a start. Other neighbors whose land had flooded came by to help, and slowly, something like a plan began to take shape. In the evenings, she returned to the Nash house, where Juliet had dinner waiting and James had usually brought home some new piece of information about Silas's schemes. They ate together, the 3 of them, and it felt dangerously close to family. "He filed another claim today," James said one night, pushing papers across the table. "The old Miller place 5 miles south of you, says the family abandoned it." "Did they?" Willa asked. "They're in Lawrence with relatives. Sent me a letter 3 days ago saying they plan to rebuild come fall." James's jaw tightened. "Silas knows that. He's just hoping they don't come back in time to fight him." "Can we warn them?" Juliet asked. "Already did. Sent a telegram this morning." James looked at Willa. "Your formal challenge goes before Judge Weatherby on Friday. You ready?" Willa thought about her father, about the way he had taught her to read legal documents by lamplight, making her trace each word with her finger until she understood. About the way he had believed in property rights and honest work and standing up for yourself even when the odds were bad. "I'm ready," she said. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable heat and a sky that promised storms. Willa dressed carefully in another of Juliet's borrowed dresses, this one deep blue and freshly pressed. She pinned her hair up, tucked the certified deed into her pocket, and walked to the courthouse with James at her side. "Just remember," James said as they climbed the steps, "you're not asking for anything. You're demanding what's already yours by law. Be firm. Don't let the judge dismiss you." "What if Silas is there?" Willa asked. he will be. He shows up to every hearing, tries to intimidate people. James paused at the courthouse door. Ignore him. Look at the judge. Speak clearly. And remember, you have the law on your side. The courtroom was smaller than Willa expected. Just a wood-paneled room with benches and a raised desk where Judge Weatherby sat, looking every one of his 73 years. And there, in the front row, sat Silas Crenshaw. He was a large man, florid and heavy, with the kind of expensive clothes that announced money. When Willa entered, he looked up and smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made her skin crawl. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk. Terrible thing about your property. I'd be happy to make you an offer, save you the trouble of rebuilding." "The property's not for sale," Willa said evenly. "Now, don't be hasty. I'm prepared to be generous. $200 cash money, that's more than you'd get at auction." "It's not going to auction." Silas's smile widened. "Well, we'll see what the judge says about that." Judge Weatherby rapped his gavel, a tired sound. "Let's proceed. Miss Harper, I understand you're filing a challenge to several property claims made under territorial statute." Willa stepped forward, very aware of James behind her, a steady presence. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Crenshaw has been filing claims on flood-damaged properties, citing Senate Bill 41 as justification. But Senate Bill 41 deals with livestock quarantine, not property seizure. There is no territorial statute that allows the county to seize damaged property." The judge frowned. "Mr. Crenshaw, is this true?" "Your Honor, I believe Miss Harper is confused," Silas said smoothly. "The statute in question is Senate Resolution 41, not Senate Bill. It clearly states that properties deemed uninhabitable for safety reasons may be remanded to county oversight." "I'd like to see that resolution," James said quietly, and Willa heard the challenge in his voice. "It's in the territorial archives," Silas said. "I'd be happy to provide a copy." "I'd like to see it now," Judge Weatherby said, sounding more awake than he had a moment ago. "Mr. Nash, do we have the territorial archive in this courthouse?" "We do, Your Honor," James said. He was already moving, heading for the records room. "I'll retrieve the relevant volume." The courtroom fell silent. Silas's confident expression began to crack at the edges. Willa stood very still, hands folded, and waited. James returned 5 minutes later carrying a leather-bound volume thick with dust. He set it on the judge's desk and opened it to a marked page. Senate Resolution 41, passed in 1856. It deals with the construction of territorial roads. There is no mention of property seizure or habitability standards. Judge Weatherby read the page, then looked up at Silas with an expression that could have frozen water. "Mr. Crenshaw, did you lie to this court?" "I must have been mistaken about the number," Silas said quickly. "The principle remains sound. Damaged properties pose a public hazard." "Show me the statute," the judge said flatly. Silas couldn't. For 10 long minutes, he bluffed and deflected while James pulled volume after volume, proving that no such statute existed. Willa watched Silas's face grow redder, his movements more agitated, until finally Judge Weatherby slammed his gavel down hard enough to make everyone jump. "Enough. Mr. Crenshaw, every property claim you have filed in the past 2 weeks is hereby suspended pending a full review of the legal justifications. Miss Harper, your deed is confirmed. Your property remains yours, and I suggest you rebuild it quickly so we can put this nonsense to rest." He looked at James. "Mr. Nash, I want a full report on my desk by Monday detailing every claim Mr. Crenshaw has filed since the flood. We're going to review every single one." "Yes, Your Honor," James said, and his smile was brilliant. Silas stood abruptly, his chair scraping. He looked at Willa with pure venom. This isn't over. Yes, Judge Weatherby said coldly, it is. And Mr. Crenshaw, if I find you've been filing fraudulent claims in my courthouse, we're going to have a much longer conversation, possibly involving the county sheriff. Are we clear? Silas left without answering, his footsteps echoing through the courtroom. Willa discovered she was shaking. James's hand touched her elbow, steadying her. You did it, he said quietly. We did it, Willa corrected. She looked up at him and saw pride in his eyes, warm and genuine. Thank you. Thank you, James replied. You just gave me the opening I've been waiting for. By Monday, we'll have every one of Silas's fraudulent claims reversed. We'll give those families their land back. Outside the courthouse, in the bright June sunshine, Willa finally let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her land was safe. Silas was exposed. The fight wasn't over, but the worst of it was done. Juliet's making pie tonight, James said as they walked back toward Main Street. Apple, I think we should celebrate. I need to start rebuilding, Willa said. I can't live in your spare room forever. James's expression shifted into something more careful. You can stay as long as you need. There's no rush. There is, though. Willa stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing in the middle of the street and people were passing around them, but she didn't care. James, you've been unbelievably kind. You and Juliet both. But I need to rebuild my life, not borrow yours. I know that. James looked like he wanted to say something else, but he just resettled his hat and smiled. All right, let's figure out what you need. Lumber, labor, supplies, I can help with that. You've already helped with everything. Then I'll help with this too. His smile widened. I'm annoying that way, ask Juliet. Despite herself, Willa laughed. Fine, but I'm paying you back, somehow. Keep fighting Silas, James said. That's payment enough. They started walking again, and Willa realized with a strange pang that she didn't want to leave the Nash house. It wasn't about the comfortable room or Juliet's cooking. It was about the way James made her laugh over breakfast, the way Juliet had started teaching her to make bread, the way the three of them sat up late talking about everything and nothing. It was about feeling less alone than she had in 3 years. That evening, Juliet did make apple pie, and they ate it on the front porch while the sun set over Main Street. James told stories about the worst legal filings he had ever seen, dramatic readings complete with exaggerated voices, until both Willa and Juliet were laughing so hard they could barely breathe. There was one, James said, wiping his eyes, where a man tried to file a claim on his neighbor's chickens because they kept crossing into his yard, said they were squatters, wanted me to draw up eviction papers. You're making that up, Willa accused. I swear on my mother's grave it's true. I had to explain to him that you can't evict chickens. What did he do? Juliet asked. Built a fence. Which is what I told him to do in the first place, but apparently he needed a government official to confirm it. James leaned back in his chair, balancing on 2 legs. People make things complicated. Usually the answer's simple, you just have to look for it. Is that your philosophy on everything? Willa asked, more or less. James looked at her and his expression was suddenly serious. People are good, mostly. They just get scared or desperate and they make bad choices. But if you give them a chance, give them the right tools, they usually do the right thing. You really believe that? Willa asked. Even after dealing with people like Silas, especially after dealing with people like Silas. Because for every Silas Crenshaw, there are 10 people like you standing up and fighting for what's right. James let his chair drop back onto all 4 legs. That's what keeps me going. Juliet stood and started collecting plates. I'm going to bed. Try not to stay up all night talking. After she left, Willa and James sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. The air smelled like coming rain and warm grass. Can I ask you something? Willa said eventually. Of course. Why law? Why records and deeds and all those dusty books? You could have done anything. James was quiet for a moment. My father lost his property when I was 14, not to a flood, just to bad luck and bad timing. Drought killed the crops 2 years running and he couldn't make the mortgage payments. Bank foreclosed. We lost everything. He spoke matter-of-factly, but Willa heard the old pain underneath. Turned out there was an error in the foreclosure papers. The bank had filed on the wrong parcel. By the time anyone realized, the property had been sold to someone else, and my father didn't have money for a lawyer. We ended up sharecropping on land that should have been ours. James, Willa said softly. He died 2 years later. Heart attack, but I think it was really the loss that killed him. He couldn't stand watching someone else work his land. James looked at her, and his eyes were bright in the gathering dark. So I learned everything I could about property law, studied every statute, every precedent, got myself hired at the courthouse, and I swore that I'd never let that happen to anyone else if I could help it. That's why you're fighting Silas, Willa said. That's why I'm fighting Silas, James agreed. Men like him see disasters as opportunities. They profit off other people's suffering, and I can't stand it. Willa reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Your father would be proud of you, she said. James's smile was sad and sweet at once. I hope so. They sat there as the stars came out, hands linked, and Willa felt something shift between them. Something deeper than gratitude, warmer than friendship. Something that made her heart beat faster and her breath catch. Eventually, the threatened rain began to fall and they went inside. James walked Willa to her room and at the door he paused. Sleep well, he said. You too, Willa replied, and watched him disappear down the hall toward his own room. She lay awake for a long time, listening to rain on the roof, thinking about a boy who had lost everything and grown into a man who fought to make sure others didn't have to. The next week brought a flurry of activity. Judge Weatherby assigned James to conduct a full review of every property transaction filed since the flood, and James worked late into every night, comparing claims against recorded deeds. Willa helped, learning to read the spidery handwriting in the old record books, cross-referencing dates and parcel numbers. They found 23 fraudulent claims. 23 families Silas had tried to cheat. We need to contact all of them, James said, staring at the list. Let them know their rights. I'll help, Willa said. I can ride to the ones in the valley. So they became a team. James handled the legal paperwork and Willa became his messenger, riding from property to property with certified copies and clear explanations. She met families who had given up hope, who couldn't believe their land could be saved. She watched grown men cry with relief, watched women hug their children and start making plans to rebuild, and everywhere she went, people asked about James. That Nash fellow, they called him. The one helping folks. He was building a reputation, Willa realized, not as a clerk, but as someone who fought for ordinary people against the powerful. One evening, she returned to find James at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, looking exhausted. Juliet was at a friend's house and the kitchen was quiet. You need to eat, Willa said, assessing him. When was the last time you had an actual meal? This morning. Maybe. James rubbed his eyes. I'm close, Willa. I've got enough evidence to bring formal charges against Silas. Fraud, forgery, attempted theft. If Judge Weatherby agrees, Silas could face criminal prosecution. That's good, Willa said, pulling out ingredients. You can tell me about it while I make you dinner. You don't have to do that. You fed me for 3 weeks. I think I can manage one meal. She started cutting vegetables, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who had cooked for themselves for years. Talk. I'm listening. So James talked, walking her through the web of fraud he had uncovered. Forged signatures, falsified dates, claims on properties that had never been abandoned. The more he talked, the angrier Willa became. He tried to steal from all those people, she said, sliding scrambled eggs onto a plate. Not just their land, their futures, their children's inheritance, everything. That's why we're stopping him. James accepted the plate with a grateful smile. Eat with me. Willa made her own plate and sat across from him. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when people are truly easy with each other. Can I ask you something? James said eventually. Turnabout's fair, Willa replied. Why haven't you ever married? I mean, not that you need to, but you're beautiful and smart and capable. Seems like you'd have had offers. Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. I had one. When I was 19. Nice man, owned a store in Lawrence. He asked me to come live with him, help run the store. What happened? He wanted me to sell the homestead. Said it was too much work for a woman alone, that we didn't need it. Willa traced the rim of her plate with one finger. But my father built that place. My mother's buried there. It's not just land to me. It's home. I couldn't give it up. So you said no, James said softly. So I said no. Willa met his eyes. Everyone said I was foolish, that I'd end up alone, that I'd regret it. Maybe I am alone, but I've never regretted it. That land is mine. I earned it. You're not foolish, James said. You know what matters. What about you? Willa asked. Handsome, employed, good man. Why hasn't some woman snatched you up? James laughed. I've been asked. Twice, actually. Both times by women whose fathers owned property adjacent to parcels I wanted to protect. Seemed like they were more interested in what I could do for their families than in me. That's cynical, Willa said. Maybe, or maybe I've just been waiting. James's gaze was steady on hers. For someone who understands what it means to fight for something. Someone who doesn't need me to rescue her but might want me around anyway. Willa's heart stuttered in her chest. James. I know the timing's terrible, James said quickly. You're rebuilding your life, and I'm in the middle of prosecuting Silas, and you're living in my house, which complicates everything. I'm not asking for anything, Willa. I just wanted you to know. Know what? Willa asked, though she thought she understood. That I'm falling in love with you, James said simply. Have been. Probably since I found you standing in that flood wreckage looking like you'd fight the river itself if you had to. And I know you don't owe me anything, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I couldn't not tell you. Willa stood, her chair scraping, and for a moment James looked stricken, like he thought he had ruined everything. But she walked around the table, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. He tasted like scrambled eggs and surprise and something sweeter. Something that might have been hope. His hands came up to her waist, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that made Willa's toes curl and her heart race. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James's eyes were bright with joy. So you feel the same way? He asked, slightly breathless. I feel the same way, Willa confirmed, though I'm fairly certain Juliet's going to say she told us so. James laughed and pulled her into his lap. Juliet's been telling me to kiss you for 2 weeks. I've been trying to be proper. How's that working out? Willa asked, kissing him again. Terribly, James admitted against her mouth. Absolutely terribly. They stayed like that, tangled together in the kitchen, until they heard the front door open and Juliet's voice calling out. They sprang apart like guilty teenagers, and when Juliet appeared in the doorway, she took one look at their flushed faces and smiled knowingly. Finally, she said. I was starting to think I'd have to lock you two in a room together. Juliet, James protested. Don't Juliet me. You've been mooning over her since the day she arrived. Juliet hung up her shawl and grinned at Willa. He's a good kisser, right? I assume that's what just happened. I'm leaving, James announced, standing. This conversation is not happening. After he fled upstairs, Juliet sat down across from Willa and took her hand. "Are you happy?" she asked, serious now. "I am," Willa said. "Is that all right?" "It's more than all right. I told you he's a good man, the best I know." Juliet squeezed her hand. "Just don't break his heart. He pretends to be easy and cheerful, but he feels things deeply. If you're not sure about this, tell him now." "I'm sure," Willa said. "I didn't expect to be, but I am." "Good." Juliet's smile returned. "Then welcome to the family. Fair warning, James snores, and he's terrible at remembering to buy firewood. Also, he'll try to solve all your problems with obscure legal precedents. You'll have to remind him that sometimes you just want him to listen." "Noted," Willa said, laughing. That night, lying in her borrowed bed, Willa thought about the strange path that had brought her here. The flood had taken everything, but it had also given her this: a second chance, a new family, and a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. She had come to town expecting to fight for her land. She hadn't expected to find love in the process. But perhaps that was how the best things happened. Not when you were looking for them, but when you were fighting for something else entirely. The next morning, Judge Weatherby issued a formal order suspending all of Silas Crenshaw's property acquisitions and demanding he appear for a hearing on fraud charges. Silas didn't appear. Instead, his lawyer showed up and tried to negotiate. "My client is prepared to return all disputed properties in exchange for dropping the criminal investigation," the lawyer said. "Your client committed fraud," James said flatly. "Returning stolen property doesn't erase the crime." The lawyer tried again. "Mr. Crenshaw is a respected member of this community. These charges will destroy his reputation." "He destroyed his own reputation when he tried to steal from flood victims," Judge Weatherby said. "The hearing stands." "Tell Mr. Crenshaw he has 1 week to appear, or I'll issue a warrant for his arrest." Willa was there for all of it, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the lawyer left, James turned to find her, and his whole face lit up. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and propriety be damned, kissed her in front of Judge Weatherby and half the courthouse staff. Someone whistled. Someone else applauded. The judge just chuckled and said, "About time, Nash." After that, it seemed pointless to hide anything. James took Willa's hand as they walked back to the house, and when they passed neighbors on Main Street, he introduced her as his sweetheart with obvious pride. "People are going to talk," Willa warned. "Let them," James said. "I spent 3 weeks pretending I was just being helpful when really I was falling for you. I'm done pretending." Juliet, predictably, was delighted. "Does this mean you're staying?" she asked Willa. "Not just in the spare room, I mean, staying with us." "I still need to rebuild my house," Willa said. "Build it later," Juliet suggested. "Or build something different. You don't have to do everything alone anymore." It was a radical thought. For 3 years, Willa had been alone, had handled everything herself because there was no other option. But now there was James, offering partnership instead of rescue. There was Juliet, offering friendship. There was a whole community of people who had fought beside her against Silas and won. "I'll think about it," Willa said, but she was already thinking about how a house on Main Street might be just as much home as a homestead in the valley. How roots could grow in more than one place. Silas's hearing arrived on a Thursday in late June. The courtroom was packed with families whose land he had tried to steal, all of them there to watch justice finally catch up to him. Willa sat in the front row, James beside her, his hand warm around hers. Silas arrived looking smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of evidence against him. His lawyer made a half-hearted defense, but James had documented everything too thoroughly. Forged signatures compared against recorded documents, false dates proven by cross-reference, testimony from families who had been pressured to sell. The judge's ruling was swift and harsh. All properties returned to their rightful owners. A fine of $5,000. And a permanent injunction preventing Silas from filing any property claims in the county without prior court approval. "You are fortunate, Mr. Crenshaw, that I am not sending you to prison," Judge Weatherby said. "Consider this your only warning. If I ever see you in my courtroom on charges like this again, you will not walk out a free man." Silas left in disgrace, and the courtroom erupted in cheers. Willa found herself swept up in a sea of grateful families, all of them thanking James, thanking her, thanking anyone who had helped. It was chaotic and overwhelming and wonderful. That evening the Nash house filled with visitors. Someone brought whiskey. Someone else brought a fiddle. Before Willa quite understood what was happening, there was a party spilling out onto Main Street, people dancing and celebrating into the night. James pulled her into a dance, spinning her until she was breathless and laughing. "We did it," he said, his eyes bright with joy. "We actually did it." "You did it," Willa corrected. "I just helped. You did more than help. You inspired people to fight. You showed them it was possible." James pulled her close and they swayed together to the fiddle music. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Partners, then," Willa said. "Partners," James agreed, and kissed her in the middle of Main Street while everyone cheered. Later, after the party wound down and the neighbors went home, Willa and James sat on the porch steps watching the stars. Juliet had gone to bed, and the night was quiet except for crickets and the distant sound of the river. "I've been thinking," James said, "about your property, about rebuilding." "So have I," Willa said. "What if you didn't rebuild the house? What if you kept the land, maybe leased it to farmers who lost everything but lived here? With me and Juliet." He spoke quickly, like he was afraid of being interrupted. "I know it's fast, and I know we should probably court properly for a year or two, but I don't want to wait. I want to wake up with you every morning. I want to build a life together if you'll have me." Willa's heart was so full she thought it might burst. "Are you asking me to marry you, James Nash?" "Yes," James said simply. "I'm asking, will you?" "Yes," Willa said and kissed him. "Yes, I'll marry you." James whooped, loud enough to wake the neighborhood, and picked her up and spun her around. "You're going to marry me," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "I'm going to marry you," Willa confirmed. "Though Juliet's going to be insufferable about this." "Juliet's going to be thrilled," James corrected. He set Willa down but didn't let go, his arms warm around her waist. "When? How soon can we do this properly?" "However soon you want," Willa said. "I've spent 3 years alone. I don't want to waste any more time." They were married 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in July, in Judge Weatherby's chambers with Juliet as witness. Willa wore a dress Juliet had sewn, pale yellow with lace at the collar. James wore his best suit and couldn't stop smiling. "Do you, James Nash, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Weatherby asked. "I do," James said, and his voice was steady and sure. "Do you, Willa Harper, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Willa said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." James kissed her like they were the only two people in the world, and Juliet cried happy tears. And Judge Weatherby chuckled and said this was the best wedding he had performed in 30 years. They celebrated with dinner at the house, just the 3 of them and Judge Weatherby, who had become an unexpected friend through all the legal battles. Someone had sent over a cake from the bakery, and Juliet had cooked a feast. "To new beginnings," Judge Weatherby toasted. "And to young people who fight for what's right. To family," Juliet added, raising her glass. "To the future," James said, looking at Willa with such love that she felt it like a physical warmth. That night, in the room that had been the spare room and was now theirs, James held Willa close and whispered, I love you." "I love you too," Willa whispered back. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other in the darkness. And afterward, lying tangled together, Willa thought about how much had changed in 2 months. She had lost everything in the flood and found something infinitely better in the aftermath. She had found James, who fought beside her instead of trying to save her. She had found Juliet, who had become the sister Willa never had. She had found a home, not in a building, but in the people who loved her. The summer passed in a haze of happiness. Willa's property in the valley became something new, transformed from homestead to community project. With James's help, she drew up contracts leasing parcels to 3 families who had lost their land, charging rent low enough that they could afford to rebuild. It felt right, using what she had to help others the way James had helped her. The house on Main Street expanded to fit their growing life. James added a small office where he and Willa worked together on property cases, helping families navigate the legal system. Word spread, and people started coming to them with problems, trusting the couple who had taken down Silas Crenshaw. Juliet, meanwhile, had opened a dressmaking business, taking over the front parlor with fabric and patterns. She hired 2 assistants and started making enough money to talk about finding her own place, though she showed no signs of actually leaving. "I like living with you too," she said when James suggested she might want more privacy. "Besides, someone needs to keep you from turning into boring married people." In the fall, Willa realized she was pregnant. She told James on a crisp October evening, standing in the kitchen where they had first kissed. "You're sure?" James asked, his hands going to her still flat stomach. "I'm sure," Willa said. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," James said, and swept her into a kiss that made her dizzy. Their daughter was born the following May, in the upstairs bedroom with Juliet and the doctor in attendance. James paced downstairs until Juliet finally called him up to meet his child. "A girl," Juliet said, placing the tiny bundle in James's arms, "healthy and loud." James looked down at his daughter, his eyes bright with tears. "She's perfect, Willa, she's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Willa asked, exhausted but happy. "Wendy," James said immediately. "After your mother, if that's all right with you." Willa's mother had died when Willa was 12, and her name had been Willa Harper. The fact that James remembered that he wanted to honor her made Willa's throat tight with emotion. "Wendy," she agreed. "Wendy Nash." Little Wendy was followed, 18 months later, by a second daughter named Penelope, who had her father's dark curls and her mother's stubborn chin. The house on Main Street grew more crowded and more chaotic and infinitely more joyful. James thrived as a father, the same way he thrived at everything. He taught Wendy to read using property deeds, which Juliet insisted was bizarre, but Willa found charming. He sang to Penelope, terrible off-key lullabies that nevertheless put her right to sleep. He and Willa worked together during the days, Wendy playing with blocks at their feet, Penelope sleeping in a cradle nearby, and it felt like the life Willa had always wanted but never quite believed she could have. "Are you happy?" James asked one evening, finding Willa on the porch watching the sunset. Inside, Juliet was singing to the girls, her voice drifting through the open window. "I'm so happy it scares me sometimes," Willa admitted. "Like maybe I don't deserve this much good fortune." James sat beside her and took her hand. "You deserve every bit of it. You fought for it. You earned it." "We earned it," Willa corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Well," James said, his eyes twinkling, "I did have a spare room. That was pretty crucial." Willa laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Best spare room I ever saw." In the years that followed, the Nash family continued to grow. A son named David arrived when Wendy was 4, serious and thoughtful even as a baby. James built an addition onto the house, expanding upward since there was nowhere to go but up. Juliet finally moved into her own place 3 doors down, though she visited daily, and the girls considered her house an extension of their own. Willa's property in the valley thrived. The families leasing the land worked hard and eventually bought their parcels outright, paying Willa fair prices that she invested in the growing town. She and James became pillars of the community, the couple people turned to when they needed help or advice or someone to stand up for what was right. Silas Crenshaw left Kansas entirely, moving west where his reputation hadn't preceded him. No one in town missed him. Judge Weatherby retired at 80, and James was offered the position of county recorder. He turned it down. "I like what we do," he told Willa, "helping people directly. I don't want to be stuck behind a desk while some clerk does the actual work." So they continued their practice, taking on cases for families who couldn't afford lawyers, documenting deeds and wills and contracts. They trained others to do the same, and slowly, a network of advocates spread across the county, all of them committed to protecting property rights and preventing the kind of predatory behavior Silas had practiced. On their 10th anniversary, James surprised Willa with a trip back to the valley. The old homestead had been transformed. One of the families leasing the land had built a beautiful farmhouse, and the fields were green with wheat. Willa's parents' graves were well tended, surrounded by flowers. "I thought you might want to see it," James said. "Make sure you're at peace with how things turned out." Willa stood looking at the land her father had claimed, the soil her mother was buried in, and felt nothing but contentment. "It's perfect," she said. "This is exactly what they would have wanted." The land being used, helping people, part of something bigger. "No regrets?" James asked. "Not a single one." Willa turned to her husband, the man who had offered her a spare room and ended up giving her a whole life. "Best decision I ever made was saying yes to you." "Best decision I ever made was riding out to check on a stubborn woman in a flood zone," James countered. He pulled her close, and they stood together watching the sun set over the valley. "Think we should head back?" "Juliet's watching the children, and you know how Wendy likes to talk her into extra dessert." "Let Juliet spoil them," Willa said. "We have a few more minutes." So they stayed, wrapped in each other's arms while the Kansas sky turned gold and pink and purple. In the distance, they could hear the river, the same river that had once taken everything. But it sounded different now, less like a threat and more like part of the landscape, just another element in the beautiful, complicated, hard-won life they had built together. When they finally returned to town, the house was in cheerful chaos. Wendy had indeed talked Juliet into extra cookies, and was now trying to teach David to read using the same property deeds her father had used with her. Penelope was sewing with scraps of fabric, making a tangled mess that Juliet was patiently trying to salvage. "How was the valley?" Juliet asked, handing James a cookie. "Beautiful," Willa said. "Different but beautiful." "Good different," Juliet pressed. "The best different," Willa confirmed. That night, after the children were asleep and Juliet had gone home, Willa and James sat in their office, reviewing documents for the next day's work. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of ordinary evening that Willa had learned to treasure. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" James asked suddenly. "If the flood hadn't happened, if I hadn't ridden out to check on you, sometimes," Willa admitted. "I think I would have rebuilt eventually, maybe married someone local, someone safe. Lived a small, careful life on that homestead." "Would you have been happy?" James asked. Willa considered this. "Maybe, in a quiet way, but I wouldn't have been this happy. I wouldn't have had you or the girls or David. I wouldn't have this life we've built together." She set down her pen and turned to face him fully. "The flood was terrible. It took everything. But it also brought me to you, and I can't regret that." James crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "I love you, Willa Nash. I loved you when you were standing in flood wreckage looking fierce and lost. I loved you when you walked into that courtroom and challenged Sela's. I loved you when you said yes to marrying me. And I love you now, more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," Willa whispered against his chest. "Thank you for having a spare room." James laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Best spare room in Kansas, according to my wife." "Only spare room that came with a husband," Willa corrected. "That made it special." They stood there, holding each other, while the house settled around them and their children slept upstairs, and the future stretched out bright and full of promise. The deed to Willa's property was filed safely in the courthouse, but the real deed, the one that mattered, was written in the life they had built together. In every choice they made to stand beside each other, to fight for what mattered, to love fiercely and completely. The years continued to pass, marked by the ordinary miracles of family life. Wendy grew into a thoughtful young woman who apprenticed with her parents, learning property law the same way James had learned it, from the ground up. Penelope discovered a talent for drawing and started documenting property surveys, her precise sketches becoming valuable legal documents. David, quiet and steady, surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher, wanting to help children the way his parents helped families. More children came. A daughter they named Rosalind, born on a snowy December night when Willa was 37 and James had gone gray at the temples. Rosalind was their last, and perhaps because of that, she was spoiled shamelessly by everyone. The house on Main Street became a landmark in town, the place where people knew they could go for help. James and Willa never turned anyone away, never charged more than people could afford, never forgot what it felt like to stand in the wreckage of your life and need someone to believe in you. Juliet married eventually, a quiet widower who owned the print shop. She had 2 children of her own, and the cousins grew up more like siblings, in and out of each other's houses at all hours. Judge Weatherby died at 86, and James gave the eulogy, talking about a man who understood that law was meant to serve justice, not the other way around. Half the county attended the funeral. The town grew and changed around them. The railroad expanded. Telegraph lines spread. New families arrived and old families moved on. But the Nash house remained constant, a steady presence on Main Street, a place where lost deeds could be found and hopeless cases could find hope. On their 20th anniversary, James took Willa back to the courthouse where they had first fought Sela's Crenshaw. The building was the same, but they were different, marked by 20 years of partnership and love and raising children and building a life. "You know," James said, standing in the courtroom where he had first produced that record book and proven Willa's ownership, "I think about that day a lot, the day you walked in here and refused to be intimidated." "I was terrified," Willa admitted. "I just didn't let it show. I know." "I could see it in your eyes." James took her hand. "But you did it anyway. That's what made me fall in love with you, I think. You were scared and overwhelmed and you had lost everything, but you stood up and fought. Because you gave me the tools to fight," Willa said. "The deed, the legal precedents, the confidence that I had the right. You gave me all of that." "We gave it to each other," James said. He pulled her close there in the empty courtroom. "Partners, remember." "Partners," Willa agreed, and kissed her husband in the same courtroom where they had won their first battle together. When Willa was 45 and James was 47, they decided to take a step back. They had trained enough advocates, helped enough families, built enough of a foundation that others could carry on the work. They didn't retire completely, but they slowed down, took more time for their family, started saying no to cases that would have consumed them a decade earlier. "We've earned it," Juliet said when Willa expressed guilt about cutting back. "You two have done more for this county than anyone has a right to expect. It's someone else's turn now." So they traveled, taking trips they had always put off. They visited Denver and Santa Fe, showing their younger children places beyond Kansas. They spent a month in St. Louis, where Penelope studied with a famous architect and Rosalind discovered museums. But they always came back to the house on Main Street because it was home. Because their story had started there, in a spare room offered to a woman who had lost everything, and because some roots ran too deep to ever pull up. When Wendy announced her engagement to a young lawyer from Topeka, the wedding was held in the backyard of the Nash house, with half the county in attendance. Willa cried happy tears and James made a rambling toast about property law that somehow turned into the most touching speech anyone had ever heard. Penelope married a surveyor, which everyone agreed was perfectly appropriate given her talent for drawing boundaries. David married one of his fellow teachers, and they opened a school for children whose families couldn't afford tuition. Rosalind, the baby, was the last to marry. She chose a farmer, a quiet man who reminded Willa of her father, and they took over one of the parcels in the valley, the same land Willa had once fought so hard to keep. "It's come full circle," James said, standing with Willa at Rosalind's wedding, watching their youngest daughter dance with her new husband on land that had started everything. "It has," Willa agreed. She was 60 now, her hair more silver than brown, but she felt young standing beside James, their children around them, the future spreading out through grandchildren who were already starting to arrive. "You remember when I asked you what you'd name the most important thing you owned?" James asked suddenly. Willa smiled. "You never asked me that, I know. But if I had back when we first met, what would you have said?" "The deed," Willa said immediately. "The land, my father's legacy." "And now," James pressed. Willa looked around at their children, at the grandchildren playing in the grass, at Juliet laughing with her husband, at the community of people who had become family over the decades. "Now I'd say this, all of it. The life we built, the family we raised, the people we helped. That's the deed that matters. That's the legacy." James kissed her temple. "I couldn't have said it better myself." They stayed until the stars came out, until the last guests went home and their children shooed them back into the house to rest. But Willa didn't feel tired. She felt alive, grateful, blessed beyond measure. That night, lying in bed beside her husband of 30 years, Willa thought about the flood that had brought them together. About how losing everything had led to finding everything that mattered. About how a spare room in a house on Main Street had become the foundation for a love that had shaped not just their lives but an entire community. "James," she whispered into the darkness. He sounded half asleep. "Thank you for the spare room." She felt him smile against her shoulder. "Thank you for taking it. Best decision of my life." "Mine too," Willa said, and meant it with her whole heart. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. 50 years of life ahead of them and 50 years of love already behind them. The deed to their happiness written not in legal documents, but in every choice they had made to choose each other, day after day, year after year. The house on Main Street stood for another 50 years after that, outlasting both of them. A testament to what could be built when two people offered each other shelter and found love in the ruins. Generations of their descendants walked its halls, slept in its rooms, and told the story of how it all began. With a flood that took everything, and a cowboy who had a copy and a spare room, and a woman who was brave enough to say yes.